Hello, my name's Toby Thompson. I'm here today with Dr. Ruth Bender, Senior Lecturer in Finance and Accounting, and Murray Steele, Senior Lecturer in Strategic Management. We're talking about risk on the board. Ruth, can risk be managed?
Yes, provided you define what you mean by risk and what you mean by managed.
Go on then.
Okay, well, companies got to take risk on the basis that if you never take a risk, you're never going to make any money. So the issue is, how much risk do we want to take? Which means you have to decide what your risk appetite is, and there's all sorts of issues with that, because people see risk differently.
Is that the individual's risk appetite or the company's risk appetite?
In theory, it should be the company's risk appetite. That's what the combined code says. But the company, the board, is made up of individuals, and every individual sees the same thing with a different level of riskiness depending on how familiar they are with it. And so it ends up being what the different individuals do.
But haven't we seen too much, Murray, too much appetite for risk because we're in a terrible situation right now, economically?
Well, I tend to agree with you. I think you can manage risk to a certain extent, but you can never utterly eradicate it. Which sometimes one of them are politicians who think you can completely eradicate it. I think we're in a situation because people took risks, but let's face it, they've been taking risks for the previous 16 years of fantastic economic growth. Yes, we've had 2 bad years, and I'm not saying it isn't dreadful for lots of people, companies and individuals who are losing their jobs, but risk management wasn't too high in the agenda in the previous years. And I think risk management can be brilliantly managed with the benefit of hindsight.
So we should put this into perspective, the current financial crisis. It comes along anyway. What comes around goes around.
Well, I would say that you could argue that it is part of the cycle. It just happens to be a bigger kind of spasm in the cycle, the biggest one that we've ever seen, probably.
I disagree with my learned colleague here. Yeah, I will accept it's cyclical, and yeah, I will agree that people lost the eye on it, but I don't think that means you can't do it. I think what happened was the whole system was geared more than ever to encourage people to take risks, and that's the problem that happened. I don't think you can just say, well, it's cyclical, it's always going to happen.
I agree, and I think a lot of the regulatory framework and the political framework said, I have abolished boom and bust. We need a light touch regulatory framework. The city's the star of the UK economy. Go for it, guys, etc., etc., etc. I'm sure there are some people who were saying, let's just be cautious. And there's a lot of companies at the moment who are doing pretty nicely, thank you, who've got cash on the balance sheet and they're finding their competitors very slowly crawling towards them saying, please buy me, because we were perhaps a little more profligate during this wonderful period. So it's not all, there are people at the moment profiting from the lack of risk management that's previously taken place. But I fully expect to see in my lifetime the same cycle happening again. I suspect that we won't see the same kind of variation, the top and the bottom of the cycle that we've seen this time, because it is one of the biggest that we've seen since the 1930s. But banks will have to start lending again. They will have to start taking risk. A bank's job is basically risk and return, so they don't make any money unless they start taking risks. So their current policy of not lending money, is a bit of a dumb one for a bank, because ultimately they're going to have to start taking risks. Now the question is, how do they manage it? At the moment they're managing it by basically saying, I'm going to keep all the money and not do anything until my balance sheet recovers, and then I'm going to start lending it out again in little bits. But I think you'll find that competition, one of the greatest economic factors in the world, will screw that for some of the banks.
So the market is a reality which you can't get away from, and the financiers rule the organisation.
Oh, that's a little bit vicious, Toby.
Go on.
Well, let's take that a bit at a time. Yes, the market works, but it works very inefficiently. And there were people at the same time, as Murray says, at the same time that there were banks and financial institutions taking shed loads of very aggressive risks. I mean, even when they knew it was wrong. It wasn't Chuck Prince who said the music's playing, we'll carry on dancing, even when he knew things were going downhill. But there were still organisations who looked at it, and I was one of the financial companies I was working with. They looked at something and they said, whoa, we can see there's a lot of money in that, but on the other hand there is way too much risk in that, and we're just staying well clear. So I think different organisations looked at the market but still set their risk appetites differently.
How much is that as an individual thing, as a non-executive director for instance? Is that something that's to do with you, your courage, your authenticity and your convictions to speak up based on your conscience, or is that more a market or a contextual thing?
I think it's a lot to do with the individuals, and I think the point you raised, the conviction to speak up, is particularly important, because you have examples. Again, in the research I did a couple of years ago, there was one example of a company, not a finance company, where the executives were absolutely gung-ho to do a particular transaction, and the non-executives said, no, we can understand why you want to do it, but we, looking at it in a more objective way, are saying this could be so bad. There is upside, but the downside would kill the company. And they said, you need to find a different way around it. But what was so really impressive there was the non-executives actually had the guts to stand up in the boardroom and say, no, we do understand this totally. We just think you've made the wrong call, and we're backing our judgment. And one of the difficult things for a non-executive, because you always have less information than the executives, don't you? So one of the difficult things for a non-executive is to get the full picture and then say, right, I understand it, but this is my judgment. I mean,
Murray, I mean, you're a non-exec. Isn't the idea of a non-exec kind of a grit in the oyster? That you've got to be a little bit annoying and stand up and say, wait a minute, why are you doing that? Isn't that part of the rule?
Well, it's a combination of what you said. It's the market knowledge, which Ruth says you can never have the same as the executives, no matter how you try, but you should try. But then it's having the courage or the guts to push the question. To me, the perfect definition of the role of the non-executive, which would cover risk management precisely, the role of a non-executive is to ensure that the company is properly run, but not to run it. Yeah. So as a good non-exec, what you have to do is ensure that there are appropriate processes of risk management in place and that they're actually being adhered to. Now, just to highlight some of the risks with this, pre all of the current financial crisis and pre all of the problems, which company do you think was the absolute perfect example of having all the corporate governance, risk management and regulatory frameworks? It had every one you could possibly have. And the answer is Enron. Okay, Enron had every single governance framework, risk management, ethics policy, you name it, it had the perfect list. Ken Lay loved corporate governance, all right? And that's pre the financial crisis. And look what happened to it. And I think everybody got caught up in the hubris of this fantastic new type company, being fantastically successful, full of extremely clever people, making shed loads of money. And it only ever announced record profits till it went bust. So I think the point about the non-exec, they have a critical role in managing risk. And that gets you back to, again, the fundamental role of the non-exec, which is to support the upside and limit the downside. And it all comes back to the questions that they ask using their experience. Now, as a non-exec, there are times when I have to start off thinking, I'm worried about this, the risks are too great in this. If I was an executive, I wouldn't do it. But then I question the executives and they give me answers. And they give me some other answers. And after a period of time, I think, okay, these guys have satisfied me that they have thought of most of the risks. I think it's unreasonable to expect them to have thought of all of the risks. One of the companies I sit on the board of at the moment, it's in Lithuania and it's right next door to Latvia, and they're looking at a massive devaluation of currency. If the same thing happens to Lithuania, our risks just multiply. But the two guys who run the company have said, we've thought about this, here's what's going to happen, and here's plan B. So I'm relatively comfortable saying we should carry on with the development of the business and carry on with our investment plans.
But couldn't you say, Ruth, that's one of the problems, that Murray's maybe male, pale and stale, sorry to say that, but and that is a diversity thing, it's a diversity or gender thing. How much is that relevant to the whole risk management on board?
Certainly, if I ignore the male, pale and stale bit, certainly there's a lot of evidence that talks about the testosterone estrogen thing and says that women have a different attitude to it. There's also a lot of evidence that says that if you have just one woman on a board, one individual on a board with a different view to everybody else, that's a very uncomfortable position to be. Psychologically, if there's two or three outliers, you get a much better position on it. But I think the whole thing comes back to culture. I mean, Murray was talking about Enron. When I lecture on ethics as my example of a perfect code of conduct, I use the Enron one. Like you said, it's a really good code of conduct. But when I'm talking to non-executives over and over again, when you say to them, what's the biggest risk that you face as a non-executive, they always talk about the culture of the company. And what they're talking about is not tone at the top, but tone from the top, and how you've got to get out and see what there is, but also to encourage the view. If I give you a very practical example,
please.
One of the companies I was talking to, it's not a finance company, it's a company where there's a lot of very heavy equipment. And the non-executives said we had a complete board change a few years ago, and we who came in every time we do a site visit to anywhere, the first thing, on principle, the first thing we do is we go down to the factory floor and we talk to the foreman and the people about what are you doing with health and safety on this machinery.
So you sound the culture out?
That's it, absolutely. He said we're showing that as far as we're concerned, this is the most important thing in our company, that we try to minimise this health and safety risk, and the way we can do it is by talking about it, not just at board level, but right the way down, and getting a feeling for the culture throughout the company about how that risk is being addressed and how other risks are being addressed.
Quite a superhuman role then for an executive to do.
Yeah,
is that gender
right.
issue, is that diversity issue a bit of a red herring? Is that too simplistic to think of it that way?
I believe it is. I got involved in a debate some years ago inside. It was then called the DTI. I think it's now called Mandelson's Bird Department. And
it's BIS now. It changed from Bear last week.
Well, it was better than it was called penis, I remember. I forget what
Only for about
PENIS stood
5
for.
minutes.
And it was only for about 5 minutes, and the government realised they made a bit of an error. And I got there was a bit of a battle going on inside the DTI, and Patricia Hewitt was running the DTI, and she wrote a pamphlet called Building Better Boards, the Argument for Diversity. And it was one-dimensional. It was just about women on boards. And it was a pathetic argument. I had to review the thing, and I reviewed it for the corporate governance people, and the thing went through, and it sank without trace, fortunately. I know some excellent women non-executive directors. I know some women who would make excellent and have been good non-executive directors before. I know some women who would come in and wouldn't say boo to a goose. I know men who sit in boards that wouldn't know whether the balance sheet was upside down or downside up if you put it in front of them, but might ask some very good questions. So I personally don't believe that there's a specific gender thing to this. Now, in diversity terms, it depends on the context. If I'm sitting on the board of a fast-moving consumer retail business and 85% of the customer base is there and all of the board are men, I'm going to be a bit worried. If they're all male, stale, 55 plus and accountants, I'd like to see 2 or 3 women who are symptomatic of the customer base sitting on that board. Okay, I don't even think it's horses for courses. One of the big issues this comes down to with NEDs is, do you need to have prior experience or do you just have to be a good NED? And the answer is a bit of a mixture of both, okay? I think there are people who can be good NEDs regardless of industry experience, because they happen to be very good at grasping a situation quickly, the financial aspects, the marketing
which
aspects,
is down to them, it's their character.
Yeah.
Which is down to their
knowledge.
character and their experience, and they can go in there and they can sum things up fairly rapidly and figure out what the 5 or 6 big issues are and what the 5 or 6 key questions are they should be asking until they get satisfactory answers. But from the cultural point of view as well, as one of the dangers of being a non-exec is you can actually push the question too far till you become almost destabilising of the board, of the harmony of the board. Although sometimes, to take your male, stale and pale, boards do become too harmonious and don't want to challenge each other, which is why you're bringing in fresh non-exec. The non-exec should never be afraid of walking away. If you're a non-exec who's doing it for the fees, that means you're not independent. And independence in all of this is a hugely prized what would you call it, characteristic. The one thing this government has done, and I'm not a natural great supporter of this government has done, but they have promoted independent non-execs in the corporate sector, in the health sector, in school trustee boards, in charities. They have really pushed quite well independent directors. And I think if you've got that independence, you're more likely to be asking questions about risk than if you haven't. But my colleague has just sighed exasperatingly and beautifully as ever. So.
Well, it does open the issue of remuneration on boards and risk management too, but we haven't got time for that. Ruth Bender, Murray Steele, thank you very much indeed. You may have some comments and issues regarding this debate. Do please leave them in the comments box below this window. Thank you very much.